Okay, applications of compound interest. So the first couple of applications are going to be special types, and then we're going to get into the general applications. All right, so the first special type is when we're losing money at a certain percentage rate every year. In that case, it is a compound interest case. So whenever you're losing money at a certain percent every year is a compound interest. And that's what this first example is. All right, 2 years ago, I invested $3,000 in a stock fund. Each year, the value of the investment declined by 10% yearly. So that means in the first year, we lost 10% of 3,000, which would put us down. 10% of 3,000 is 300. So that would put us at 2,700 at the end of the first year. And then we lose 10% not on the 3,000, but on the 2,700. Which then we lose $270 in the next year, and so on. And so whenever you're losing money by a certain percent, it's always the compound interest. And so there's two things about it, though, when I'm losing money by a certain percent. First thing is, since it's a loss, our interest rate is a negative 10%. We're losing 10. So that's the first thing. If it's a declining percent, you put a and you would do the same thing if you're plugging into the formula. It would go in as a negative decimal. In our TVM solver, it's going to go in as a negative percent. The second thing is the per year. The per year is the compounding. Every year you're losing 10% on the previous year's ending mark, right? So it compounds. And so in this case, it's compounding once a year. All right, so our M is 1. So those are the two things you pull from it. Right, and then there are two parts to this. The first part, so that's again the biggest thing about this special type. When we're losing it, we have to do a negative percent, and then compounding period. It doesn't say compounded, but it's implied by the fact that I'm losing the same percent every year. And it's the percent of whatever that year was started at. So the first year started at 3,000, but the second year starts at 2,700. I can plug it into the formula, or I can plug it into the calculator, and I'm going to plug it into the calculator. Alright, so there's two parts. We invested 2 years ago. Alright, and so we want to know what's the value of the investment after 2 years. And so it is, even though it's the investment now, it's a 2-year future value. So I am looking for a future value, which should be less than 3,000. It's a future value after 2 years, after my money went down by 10% per year for 2 years. And so plugging it into the calculator, right, N, our percent, present value, again, there's a PMT, that's just 0 for now, future value, and our compound and interest rate, which those need to be the same, that's 1, right, M is 1. N is how long, so remember it'd be 1M is 1 times 2, and so that's just 2, right, 2 years it loses 10% twice. It's losing, so I've got to remember that's a negative 10 when I plug in my interest rate. So I've got to remember that's a negative, right? Because it's losing money. And then the present value is also negative because that $3,000 I initially invested, right? $3,000 was my initial amount, my present value. I took that $3,000 out of my pocket and put it into the stock market. While it's in the stock market for that first 2 years, I don't touch it. I can't spend it, I can't do anything with it, and so it's a negative amount, so it's a negative there. Future value is what we're going to solve for. Alright, so remember, when we solve for something, that's when we put our cursor here, and we hit alpha, enter. Alright, and that's how we solve. Right? So if you plug all that in, you hit alpha, enter. The future value, which to check to make sure you've done it right, the future value should come out smaller than the initial amount because I'm losing money. And it does. If you plug that in just like I did there, it comes out to 2,430, which that checks. That seems reasonable. After 2 years, That's what I'm going to decline down to, all right, which is what the investment. So this is the value of the investment now, after 2 years. And that was the first half of the question. The second half of the question, right, there are two parts to this. So I did the first part. And so the second part is, well, what if this continues? Right? In the stock market, you don't lose your money until you take it out. All right, so we lost money in the first 2 years, so we're going to sort of write it out. And so what happens, though, if I decide to wait 5 more years? I still don't touch my money at all for 5 more years. What's the value of my investment then at the end of 5 more years? Well, there's a catch to this. All right, so what if you leave the stock for 5 more years and it has the same pattern and you're still lose 10% per year? Now, the trick is it's 5 more years. We already went 2 years, and so time is 7 years. 7 years. My investment has been in my stock for 7 years, not 5 years. It's really easy to make the mistake and use 5. You could technically use 5. If you did use 5, you would have to plug this as your starting value because that's where you're starting at when you start 5 more years. But I think it's best to start with the original principal amount. All right, so the investment was in there for 7 years, right? We invested for 7 years. Our N is still, again, 1 times time, which now is 7 years, or again, you could just type in 7. Interest is still, so that's really the only thing that changes from our previous list. That's still negative 10. Present value is still negative 3,000. That's still 0. Future value is 1. And then the ones at the bottom are still 1s, all right? They stay the same. This is the one we're going to solve for. So we do the same thing. We hit alpha, enter, and solve. And when we solve, this comes out to $1,434.89. And so after 5 more years, which would be 7 years, its value is now $1,434.89. So that's an example of if we are losing money by the same percent every year, it's a compound interest case. You have to remember the interest rate goes in there as a negative and time is 1 because it's per year. Alright, so that was a special example. The next video I'm going to do a second special example where we'll be doing time. Time is another one that's a little tricky, and then after that we're just going to do a bunch of different applications mixing them together.